care am ajuns atunci. Și pot să vă mărturisesc acum, cu 2 zile înainte de predică o țineam în fiecare miercuri din săptămână.
Și ne-am întors încet. A fost foarte dureroasă întoarcerea noastră, n-a fost
Between my first period of imprisonment and the second period, there was no difference. The torture, the brutality was the same. For instance, in 1980, I was very sick in the hospital prison Jilava.
I was born into a peasant family, the youngest of the 11 children, all born between 1902 and 1925. I was the last born. Like all villages, ours was quiet and remote from the city. Outside influences were small. The crafting of homemade goods was flourishing. Our shirts and coats were hand-woven at home. All the young girls prepared their own dowry, and every peasant's house had a special room where one could enter only with the girl's permission. That room stored all the pillows, rugs, and everything else that made up the dowry. The girls would start working on it when they were about 12 to 14 years old. They all knew how to weave and sew. Life in the village was very beautiful. We lived in the delta of the Danube River, a paradise on earth. We had our own cropland. There were ponds in all their natural beauty. We owned boats and fishing tackle. There was a multitude of wild birds. It was so beautiful and wild, a life rustling with snakes, frogs, insects. Everything abounded there. It was a different world. Our spiritual life was very profound. We confessed and communed regularly at Pascha and Christmas. The whole village community revolved around the parish priest and the church.
Comunitatea biserica satului era strânsă în jurul preotului și în jurul bisericii.
We were 9 children left in the family. When we went to church in the winter, it was very cold because there was no heat in the church.
Când mergeam la biserică,
So we wore warm shoes and bundled up.
era frig, ne încălțam bine.
Because our feet hurt from standing during the service, we tried to trick our mother into letting us go outside. And our mother would say, "Children, you don't know what prayer means. You don't know how to pray. But your footache is your prayer to God."
Ai rugăciunea voastră către Dumnezeu.
I think that if I were to weigh the knowledge acquired at the seminary against what I've learned from my mother, I'd say that I have learned more theology from my mother. For many years, maybe 30 or 40, she listened to the homilies read in church, and she knew many of them by heart. She knew the lives of the saints and their miracles, and she used to give us short lessons from the homilies. That's how I grew up in the countryside. Until I went to high school, I never left my village, which was only 30 kilometers away from the capital city of Tulcea County. I never traveled out. I didn't feel the need to.
All those who joined the Brotherhood of the Cross and the national resistance movements were true fighters because they had the courage to say a categorical no to the communist regime. With the Russian Red Army looming, and when everyone was trying to appease the Russians, firmly stating, "No, I am against it," was a true act of courage.
It was a matter of faith. This was of utmost importance because the Bolsheviks were tearing down churches while we considered the church to be very holy and almost otherworldly. They were demolishing churches. So, all these events motivated us. In addition, by reading legionary and other anti-communist materials, we realized that this whole empire of the East was an empire of destruction.
When the empire of destruction took over the entire country, the mouths of the Bolshevik prisons ravenously swallowed up any form of anti-communist resistance. In May 1948, Gheorghecalciu, then a student at the medical school in Bucharest, was arrested along with others for legionary activity and was sentenced to 8 years of incarceration for plotting against the state's national security.
My interrogation lasted for a month, and then I was sent to Pitesti prison. The atmosphere there was great because of the former political prisoners from under Marshal Antonescu's regime, who had been sent there. Among them Nadim, Maxim, Yanolida, and Gheorghecalciu, who was the soul of the group. They created a special atmosphere, different from what we had come to know before, because we had an unyielding warrior's attitude, as if nothing bad would ever happen to us. Instead, the mystical experience gained by Gheorghecalciu, Yanolida, and others like them during prior detentions tempered our enthusiasm and our boldness.
It was so beautiful, and there was so much inner peace. All anxiety, all arguments, and all misunderstandings among us vanished. We truly formed a brotherhood.
At one point during our imprisonment in Pitesti, we began a form of collective, continuous prayer. We would pray in our cell for about an hour. Then we would knock on the wall of the cell next to us, and the second cell would pray for an hour, then the third cell, and so on. Like this, the prayer continued uninterrupted. Fragments from the Bible, saved from body searches by the older inmates, circulated among us. We also transmitted entire Gospels by Morse code. To memorize the texts, we would carve them in bars of soap and then learn them by heart. This fragmented reading of the Holy Scripture worked deeply within us.
We were bound by the same creed. We were all kindled by the same flame.
The Pitesti period was a time of absolute spirituality. In that environment, all physical and material elements, the persons and objects of torture, were only instruments of the battle between God and Satan.
The re-education, an experiment planned in the communist laboratories of Moscow and Bucharest, was initiated at Pitesti and carried out through a few political prisoners used as tools of the Securitate.
It was when the re-education started that Țărcanu came. We want to re-educate. If there is anyone here who doesn't understand that all of you must be re-educated, he needs to speak up now. No one said a word. Or maybe someone, a Macedonian, tried to say something. And in that split second, a signal was given. I couldn't tell exactly how it all happened and what type of signal Țărcanu gave. They began hitting us in the head with wood planks torn off of bunks and beds, with broomsticks. To this day, I still can't figure out how it all happened. They were prepared for it.
Gheorghecalciu entered the soul-crushing mill of the Pitesti re-education in December 1950, along with all his fellow inmates.
I'll never forget the day when I faced Țărcanu, not because I feared him, although he caused a mystical fear within us when he showed up, nor even for his insults or beating, but because I felt a tremendous force, and he had within him this extraordinary mystical force, but it was a diabolical one.
Țărcanu had become possessed by the devil. Had Dostoevsky lived to write about this entire Pitesti period, he would have created a literary masterpiece. That demonization was manifested by such hatred. A hatred so great that the more they saw someone resist, the more they beat him.
We believed that we could do anything in this life, that we could fight against communism. Maybe we considered ourselves our nation's saviors. But God showed us who we really were.
In the fall of 1957, George Calciu and other inmates sentenced to re-education were taken to Jilava prison, where the Securitate had prepared yet another experiment for them. Kasimka, a stone grave in which the prisoners were buried alive.
16 of us were sent to a special ward. In a cavern shaped like a semi-cylinder, they had built 5 cells wedged against the walls, with no light, no air, and only 2 or 3 holes at the bottom of the door for air circulation. 16 souls were buried alive in that vault. During that period, all 4 prisoners from the cell next to ours died. Another person died in the cell across from us. Other 2 inmates died in the cell farther down, as did Konstantin Operation from our own cell. Within a 2-year period, nearly half of us died. Those were extermination cells with a special regimen. No air, no light, only beatings, starvation, and special torture. In that cell, we managed somehow to prolong Konstantin Operation life. Although the water was permanently dripping down the walls, the floor was always wet, the mattresses would rot underneath us, and Operation was not receiving any medication.
Operation was lying in bed with his lungs crushed in his chest, choking and spitting blood and sputum. Only Calciu washed his drinking glass. We should have washed it too, but Calciu had made the commitment to do it alone, although he was as disgusted by it as the rest of us. Poor Operation was suffocating. How were we to help him?
I remembered that penicillin was made from mold. So, every evening I would place a piece of bread under the bed where it was moist, and in the morning the mold on the bread grew tall almost by 2 fingers and with knobs. Then we took this spawn mold, dissolved it into water, filtered it through a piece of gauze and placed it by Operation's nose, so he may inhale from this mycelium.
Despite all our efforts, we failed to save him. Out of generosity and desperation, because we were all desperate, but Calciu was more sensitive than we were. Seeing that Operation was dying, he said, "What if we gave him lymph to drink, to strengthen him?" I said, "Let's give it to him, but where do we get it?" Joseph added, "It's not good to hold him back if it's his time to go." But Calciu, impetuous as he was, said, "Whether you agree to it or not, I know what to do." He retreated by Operation's bed, placed his mess tin down, cut his veins here, and bled into the tin. Then he waited for the blood to settle, so the lymph would separate from the red cells. The yellowish lymph floated up to the surface. He decanted the liquid and gave it to Operation to drink. At such gesture, Joseph and I were dumbstruck because we realized that we could never do such a thing.
By the time I arrived at Aiud prison, they had started the re-education program there. After about 1 month, I was taken into a sort of a club. I'd rather not give any names because I do not want to accuse anyone. A club leader announced that it was time for our unmasking. I smiled at him and said, "Sir, you know that I'm coming from Pitesti. What else do you expect me to disclose?" At Pitesti, not only did I unmask, but things there got terribly out of hand. I have nothing to say to you, and I'm not interested in re-education. Then they put me in solitary confinement, where I remained until my release.
The freedom that George Calciu received after 16 years of incarceration was in fact an extended imprisonment in communist Romania, where rehabilitation was mandatory for the entire population. Even so, he decided to start his life once again. In 1965, he married Adriana Dumitrisa, the sister of two former political prisoners. As he was no longer allowed to continue his medical studies, he enrolled at the Faculty of Philology and became a French teacher at a high school in Bucharest. Later on, he also graduated from the Faculty of Theology in Bucharest with the support of Patriarch Justinian Marina, who removed his past as a former political prisoner from his records. He was then ordained a priest in 1972 and appointed as a teacher at the Theological Seminary in Bucharest. George Calciu was thus fulfilling the promise made in prison to serve Christ for the rest of his life.
After graduating from the Faculty of Theology in January 1972, I was ordained as a priest and began teaching at the Theological Seminary in Bucharest. There, I encountered truly exceptional young people with high aspirations. Over time, I grew very close to my students, taking an interest not only in their theological education, but also in their personal lives, their souls, their doubts, their failures, and their triumphs. This approach forged a strong bond among us.
He addressed his 7 words to the youth, because the youth has high aspirations. The youth dedicate themselves, they take risks, they sacrifice themselves. His word was like the word of the prophets, like a whip, like a sword that cuts and splits. You were either with him or against him. You couldn't be indifferent. And indeed, the communists were not indifferent to his words.
My 7 words to the youth, as I called them, were divinely inspired. I must admit that despite my fervor afterwards, I never again achieved that same level of theological expression. I delivered my sermons each Wednesday during the Great Lent, spanning 7 weeks for 7 sermons. On Mondays, I had no idea what I would say on Wednesday. But on Tuesday nights, God would send me His divine inspiration, and by Wednesday, my homily was ready.
Father Calciu's audacity to warn young people about the spiritual slavery to which they were subjected fell like a thunderbolt on the communist regime in Bucharest. First, the Securitate closed the church, then the gates of the Radivota Theological Seminary, but the young students climbed up walls to hear the word of God.
I was arrested and condemned to death. They accused me of being an agent of a foreign power and of undermining the national security by serving a hostile power. They did not mention which power, because it was a setup.
That was when they locked him up together with 2 criminals. One of them had killed his wife or mistress, and the other had killed his mother. They were real brutes. They began to torture Father by not allowing him to sit or use the waste bucket, and so on.
I was in a IUD prison, and it was the night before Pascha. I had prepared myself through fasting, vigil, and prayer for the Resurrection Sunday. Right at midnight, I heard the bells tolling in town. It was like a message sent to us from the outside world celebrating the resurrection of Christ. The next morning, the guards changed shifts at 7 a.m. That Easter morning, the guard on duty was a handsome but very cruel man who took pleasure in torturing others. This man felt joy only when he beat 5 or 6 inmates during his shift. That night I prayed, saying for hundreds, maybe thousands of times, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. I wanted the truth of the resurrection deeply ingrained in my mind and my heart. I was facing the door as he entered my cell. I said, "Christ is risen." He didn't look at me, but turned his head away and glanced at the other guards behind him. Then he turned back to me and said, "Truly, he is risen." His answer came like a blow to the head. I realized that not he, but the angel of God answered, "Truly, he is risen." Through his mouth, the mouth of my enemy, God's angel gave me a much-needed confirmation of the truth of the resurrection. My cell was flooded with light.
Following the thousands of protests in the West and the diplomatic pressure put on Romania, on August 20th, 1984, Father Calciu was released from prison. In August 1985, the Calciu family was expelled to the USA. In the beginning, Father was a missionary priest with the Romanian Orthodox Episcopate of the Romanian Home Association. He also gave lectures and met with state officials. In parallel, he worked in construction to provide for his family.
I actually received a job offer outside of the government setting that was very, very attractive financially. And it was right on and about when the Iraq conflict had started, so a lot of contracting opportunities and a lot of money being pipelined towards that particular target. So it was a very demanding job. And at that very same time, I got this offer that would require me to go to Iraq with a group of 17 people. And I was very excited. It was a lot of money. And I came to Father and I told him, "Look, this opportunity came up and it's great. I'm going to give you half of the money. You can start building your church." And he very calmly, I thought that he would be as excited as I was. And very calmly, he looked at me and he said, "Yes, church buildings are important. Money is very important too. It's a lot of money. I wouldn't even think about making that money for decades." And he looked at me with those very deep blue eyes. And he said, "But I also hear that Iraq is very dangerous these days. If anything happens to you, are you ready?" And I have always had an answer to whichever question people came in front of me with, being in front of Joint Forces Command and so forth, facilitating interactions, at times with a twist of arrogance in there. And Father, with that very simple question, I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what being ready meant. And I was completely paralyzed. And I looked at him and I said, "What do you mean by being ready?" And he immediately said, "Rosanna, buildings are very important because that's where where people gather to worship. And money is important because you can't survive without it. But the true church of Christ is in your heart. Let's talk about building that true church of Christ in your heart first." When we stopped his treatment and he told me, I said, "Father, you do understand what is going to happen if we stop your treatment." And at that day he said, "Maria, I love you just like if you were my own daughter, but I must go and say goodbye to my people."
At the end of his 2-week pilgrimage to Romania, Father's health condition worsened. He had an emergency operation at the military hospital in Bucharest, where he spent a whole month, time during which he was a rather unusual patient.
Father remained engraved in my heart and my soul as an icon of peace. He was an icon of Christ, a beaming image of joy and sacrifice. I kept thinking how, although he had studied medicine and had enough medical knowledge, he never asked about the kind of treatment he was receiving, the results of his blood work, his medical records, never. Those things did not matter to him. You, the person standing in front of him, you were the most important. You and his soul before God. In his alone moments, although Father was bedridden, I could feel he was kneeling before God. Maybe the most powerful image that I kept in my heart is Father comforting a young girl dying of cancer. There he was, leaning toward her, talking to her so peacefully and embracing her in the light of Christ. I was left with that image as an icon of generosity and sacrifice for those in need, coming from someone who knew so well what suffering was.
When I visited him at the hospital, there was such a long line of people waiting to see him. The hospital security was there because no other patient had ever had so many visitors.
We needed to be there, keeping vigil at our Father's bed.
On November 21, 2006, on the feast of the entrance of the Most Holy Theotokos into the temple, Father George Calciu died at the Fairfax Hospital. His soul entered the heavenly church, took place at Christ's feet. All the pain and love amassed in such a large amount during his lifetime. Sometimes, when the air is clear and the sky is serene, semitron-like echoes resound over the villages of the Danube Delta. The fishermen say that those are the souls of the righteous descending upon the waters to bring tidings of life after death, as a call to brotherhood between heaven and earth.